Shall we get started? Shall we all mosey on up? Phone switched off, everybody?
Yes.
Yeah? There isn't really enough space. Right, good morning, everybody. We've had a good first session, and we're about to kick off with number 2 on the subject of governance, particularly around developing governance structures as firms grow in size and complexity. I started off trying to come up with a definition of governance that we could use and use that as the basis of discussion. And I gave it up after a little while because I found it was actually quite a difficult thing to do. One thing I did realize was that culture is very important, and maybe that's an important part of the definition. I also realized that one size probably doesn't fit all, particularly as firms are growing, as investor demands and regulator expectations are changing. And these are some of the areas we're going to hopefully cover off in our discussion today. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce the panel. So starting closest to me, Mike Chambers, who's been with Cordium now for about 6 years. He works in the Financial and Regulatory Reporting Division, which I'm the partner in, and he heads our Prudential practice. Next to Mike is Scott Palmer, who's the Head of Operational Due Diligence at the University Superannuation Scheme. He's formerly worked at JP Morgan, Amber Partners and Royal Bank of Canada, and like myself, at PwC. The other interesting fact about Scott is that he speaks much better Chinese than I do. Moving on, we have Adam Domenico, who is the CEO of our business in Malta. Adam is also formerly PwC. You may be noticing a little bit of a trend here, and was formerly the CFO and COO of a commodity trading advisor before establishing Zodiac Advisory Services, which is now Cordium Malta. Adam is the director of a number of fund boards and will bring an interesting perspective, I hope, to the discussion today. And last but not least, we have Reggie Dodge, who's the General Counsel and Head of Compliance at Emso, which was a spin-out from Citibank, specializing in emerging markets. Reggie is on AIMA's Sound Practices Committee, and they recently republished their guidance for fund directors, and I'm sure she will bring some interesting perspective to the conversation as well. So thank you all for joining us, and let's get going. So the first question I wanted to really pose was really to seek the panel's views on what areas should be covered by a governance structure within a firm. And I'd like to start with Scott, first of all.
I guess with the University Superannuation Scheme, just to give you a little bit of background. The University Superannuation Scheme is one of the largest private occupational pension schemes in the United Kingdom. And we have about 48 billion sterling in assets we manage for the professors and senior staff at universities and tertiary education institutions in the UK. We do have a significant internal sort of trading business or function, and we have a lot of external managers that we allocate to. And my function's overseeing the operational risk associated with those managers. So when we talk about governance, I guess the first thing we look for, of course, is the board of directors and the independence of the board of directors and I guess quality is a difficult word, but effectively the quality and competence of that board of directors. But the board of directors, as you well know, is involved quarterly, sometimes less, but not looking after the day-to-day activities of the firm. So if anything goes wrong, hopefully they'll be one of the first people to hear, but arguably they would hear later, and they'd be in less of a position to affect or to mitigate or prevent things from happening in the day-to-day operations. So we look, in terms of governance, we also think of oversight. And we think of sort of committees, and we think of who's participating in those committees. Are there non-investment staff? Is there, say, for example, an operational risk committee? Is there a valuation committee? Who's on the valuation committee? What power does the valuation committee have? And how do they get involved in overseeing valuation? How does the operating risk committee or the technology committee get involved with setting up the structure and the strategy of the firm? And how does that contribute to the mitigation and ideally the prevention of operational risk? We try to I say we don't have a universal standard, but we try to contextualize these desires, whatever. We have a preferred status and acceptable status. So for smaller firms, I think there's more of a challenge. How do you get an operational risk committee with 5 members on it if your staff is only sort of 10 people in the organization? Do you need a valuation committee if you're only doing exchange-traded equity? Do you get external counterparties involved? We have a lot of private equity and there's a lot of third-party valuation. So there are challenges. I think one of the things we look at also, and Cordium obviously and the other providers in the market, is there's a lot of services that are rented these days in terms of from an operational standpoint, from a risk standpoint, from a compliance standpoint, technology. So we're quite keen that we think you can get the competence, the experience, and the resource bandwidth by renting services. We do get comfort from that, from outsourced service providers, in addition to what's happening inside. On valuation committees, obviously, if the external auditor is present, that provides comfort to us. So I think it's the governance. We do look broadly at how a firm is run and what the culture is. And Matthew will talk about a bit later. But one of the other things, digress a little bit, we also look at management co-investment in the strategy, and we think, well, if the main source of income for the manager is the return on investment from their co-investment as opposed to fees, we think that they're more likely to act in the interest of the investors and more likely to have a better corporate governance framework for the firm and for the investors than if the manager's prime source is sort of earning fees and gathering assets. So those are some of the elements we look at, and we sort of take the balance of all the elements, all the oversight and sort of governance features of the organization, and then we make a judgment as to whether we think it's acceptable, and if it's not, we might offer some improvements to the manager.
Great, thank you, Scott. Reggie, do you want to contribute now? I'm thinking particularly around what's changed in the scope of the guidance from EMA on governance.
Well, I think the new fund director's guide came out, and it had certain suggestions. Many of it, I think, is embedded in kind of standard thinking about governance. I think there's a big question that people have in governance, and I include fund governance, manager governance, because those are kind of two different. But Scott's point about oversight is critical, and I think the evolution that we're seeing both from investors and from sound practice guides, et cetera, is also a nuance of oversight, which is challenge. So, if you think of oversight as sort of almost conceivably you can do oversight by ticking boxes. But challenge is a different being, which is really having people who are empowered and who take on board the idea that they're not just checking that things are done correctly, but they're challenging fundamental principles of how they're done, et cetera, at the board level and at the committee level. And I think you're seeing a lot of that now, increasing from regulators, from investors. I think good governance in both fund structures and company structures has a lot to do with empowerment. And that's a bit of a change, because I would say 10 years ago, you weren't really having fundamental discussions about what is independence. Are your professional fiduciaries independent? How do you structure your board? What is composition? I think there are people who've always been fundamentally focused on the quality of the composition of the board. Other people just tick the box by having a board, and consider that we've done our job, we have a board, and now let's boss them around. So I think the substance of governance is increasing. I think it should increase, so I think that's a good thing. But I think that's one of the key differences over, say, the last decade. And I think we're actually only partway through that journey. I think you're going to see more scrutiny from investors. On ODDs, we're getting a lot of scrutiny from investors on board composition, on the size of the board, on the empowerment of the board. We're getting quite a lot of due diligence requests on our committee structures, who's on the committees, how empowered those individuals are, et cetera, in a way that even 5 years ago you weren't getting as much focus.
Thanks, Reggie. So, a lot of discussion about the board already, so it seems only natural that I hand over to Adam at this point to give us the view from the board of directors.
Thank you. Obviously, there's been a lot of change lately, and I agree with both Scott and Reggie in that we've seen a lot of guidance notes being issued from the regulators, from IMA. I think we're getting to the right place from a governance perspective. People are talking about it. Here we are today on the panel. But there have been changes, so we touched upon valuation. So the boards in general, be it the board of the fund, is now having to have more detailed discussions with be the valuation committee at a AIFM level, or the AIFM itself having a valuation committee itself, whereas previously they may have delegated or subcontracted the valuation. There's also risk management, right, because of the AIFM directive particularly, as we all know, and previously UCITS, and coming up again, UCITS again. There's a big element on risk management, and hence the board composition itself that Reggie touched upon. How do you really compose a board? Should there be somebody who's focused on risk management, who's focused on regulatory compliance, but naturally that person might, take too much responsibility in the respective areas. So the changes I've seen recently, I believe, are good. So we've touched on valuation, touched on risk management. I think general good governance discussions and empowering the board members is critical, but also the competence of the board members at both the AIFM and the AIF level. And that goes to all the board members, right? So whoever it may be, particularly, obviously, the independent director. So what is an independent director? I don't think anyone can be truly independent because somebody refers the job to that person, so he's going to be somewhat he doesn't need to obviously look at whoever it is, the service provider, whatever, but ultimately there's always a link. But as long as there's an independent person on the board, mainly from the core functions, I believe, so definitely the investment manager and maybe others, like even valuation itself or maybe NAV or other, as long as there's one independent person, but that independent person must be competent and if you wish, have the character to be able to stand up to discussions, because it's very easy to say, yes, you have an independent director, but then when there are issues or sensitive matters, that person might not stand up and lift up his hand and say, no, I don't agree with it. And touching back onto Scott's point, ultimately, what is a board? And a board, yes, it's good governance, yes, it's right, yes, the investors want to see it, and now more often than not, investors actually at times calling into directors. I had one call not too long ago from a large potential investor to a client of mine, where we just discussed the general topics we're discussing today. So there is that. But ultimately, there has to be an element of just general good aspects. And touch upon as well, what I was getting to is the oversight angle. I think an area where we've seen a lot of improvement lately, and something I really favor, is the oversight. So it's one thing saying you're a board and carrying out your quarterly board meetings, but you need to be able to follow up that from time to time with going down to visit the service providers, be it the manager, be it the valuation committee, be it the administrators, whatever it is, to actually feel, touch, scrutinize, and carry out your responsibility, be it yourself as a board member or delegating to somebody to carry out that job. Those are the main things.
Thanks, Adam. Bring things back to the firm for a minute. One of the things that we're seeing increasingly in Cordium is interest of the regulator in governance within a firm around its capital matters. So maybe I'll ask Mike to give us a bit more flavour around that.
Sure. We are certainly seeing an increase in focus from the regulator, both the FCA and around or various other regulators around the world, on prudential matters, that being ICAP, or the process thereof and the documentation of that process, capital adequacy and the monitoring of capital adequacy. And there's been quite a lot of changes for investment firms and fund managers in the last few years, namely CRD4 and AIFMD from a regulation perspective. So firms have had a lot to do to get their house in order. The FCA recently announced that they plan to look at every IFPRU firm's ICAP in the next 3 years. So there's a lot to do for firms who haven't yet fully documented that process. And they normally only give you a 2-week window to get documentation to them. So if it's not already completed, then it's worth getting that done already. From a supervisory review and evaluation process, we've seen a couple of our firms recently undergo scrutiny from the FCA. They're focusing a lot on the identification of material risks to the business, be it key man or critical outsourcing or key investors, for example. And there's also a focus towards liquidity. A panel I attended recently with the FCA, they mentioned that the majority of the failures they've witnessed of firms that they regulate recently has been in relation to liquidity rather than capital. So there's a large focus towards the monitoring of liquidity adequacy as well as capital. And just a real-life example of how the monitoring of capital adequacy can really affect the value of your business is a business was in the process of selling to a prospective buyer. They hadn't been appropriately monitoring their capital, and due to a very subtle change in rules, historically it transpired that they hadn't had adequate capital for some time, and consequently hadn't notified their investors as such. And in the process of due diligence, that came to light, and the cornerstone investor withdrew their funds, and what would have been a 8-figure deal reduced to no more than a 4-digit deal. So it's about protecting the value of what you've built as opposed to just following rules as such. Some other trends that are emerging from the regulators are increased scrutiny on the process of application and getting authorised in the first place. A lot of queries we get back from the FCA are about justification of the actual quality of capital that's being injected, be it audited reserves. They actually want to see the audit opinion on financial statements, which may not have been the case previously. And they also potentially want to see extended forecast periods when seeking application to make sure that the business model is sustainable and that you do have effectively adequate governance around capital adequacy on a long-term basis. And that's not just in the UK. For example, FRR, or Financial and Regulatory Reporting Division in the UK, deals with Hong Kong regulated businesses and their financial resources returns. The SFC can actually, or have done in the past, drill down into underlying accounting gap and the appropriate treatment thereof. So it's not necessarily possible to pull the wool over their eyes in terms of tweaking underlying accounting treatments to make sure you kind of meet capital requirements.
Right, thank you, Mike. We've touched on culture already, and empowerment was a word that I heard used a number of times, and as was challenge. Maybe we can dig a little bit deeper into some real-life examples now. Reggie, would you like to give us a flavour for the challenges you faced on leaving the bank and setting up Emso as an independent business?
Yeah, so we were in probably a slightly unique-ish position in that we spun out of Citigroup about 2.5 years ago, kind of Dodd-Frankish. And that put us in a position of being kind of a startup mentality with a 15-year track record, which is nice. That's a nice place to be. But when you're in a startup mentality, you're sort of reconsidering all these fundamental, who you want to be as a separate and distinct entity from Citi. You want consistency because we had, most of our investors are legacy of investors who knew us when we were part of Citi. You can make your judgments about Citi's view of governance, but it was a less bespoke governance culture for us as we spun out. It was more of Citi-driven. And so coming out of Citi, we then got to rebuild our structure, which we're still in the process of doing. And we've put a lot of thought into it. We've talked to consultants, to investors. We listen to investors very, very closely. Usually when an investor makes an observation about our governance and sort of says, oh, you could do better if you did X, 90% of the time we do X within about 2 weeks, mostly because what they're saying makes sense. And anything we can do to make our governance structures sounder, such as for a while on our fund boards, we had 2 directors from the same fiduciary company. We changed that. We were considering changing that to having them from separate fiduciary companies. We always had a a completely independent director. But based on investor feedback, we decided to put a member of the investment manager on the board. And that was sort of a recent change because we're getting more feedback now. And that's also a big change, again, going to independence. It used to be that was kind of slightly frowned upon. Now you're seeing that it's kind of best practice to have kind of minority investment manager representation on a fund board. It's viewed as sort of skin and liability in the game. You've got the Irish Corporate Code, which is advising that that's what they want to see as well. That's kind of a big evolution. But then there's sort of the investment manager structures, and you've got the board there. We recently brought on a fully independent investment manager director. I think that's quite noteworthy. It's not someone our CEO shoots with. It's not his buddy from a past life. It was someone unknown to him. He basically went to a senior management team and said, throw before us some good candidates, and he picked the one he liked best. He's now looking for a second one. I think that's, I'm thrilled about that because I think it's unusual to have a majority shareholder, CEO, founder who actually wants genuine challenge from smart strangers. But if you can have that culture, that's something you want. The final prong for us is just all the committees we're still kind of forming committees. I jokingly said recently that we should have a committee because we have an ops committee, a technology committee, evaluation committee, a counterparty committee, fiduciary committee, risk committee, social committee. But we, I think when we first spun out of the bank, there was sort of this sense of freedom. And then you realize to run a really sound business, you really have to sort of overlay quite a lot of control, oversight, discussion. Key to these committees is that they're not really ad hoc. We don't meet as necessary because if you make them ad hoc, nobody ever meets. You kind of decide, is it going to be a monthly committee? Is it going to be every other month? Is it quarterly? And you set that schedule. Sort of in January, I went through and I set the schedule for about half of our committees. So people know the dates for their November committees meetings now, which creates a certain discipline. But at Emso, we view governance as absolutely critical to how we run the business, and we feel very confident in speaking to both regulators and investors about that structure, and we're always looking for sort of challenge and feedback to make it even sounder.
Thanks, Reggie. Adam, as a board director, how do we actually go about in practice delivering that level of independence, which is clearly very important?
Absolutely. I think Reggie also touched upon it, finer detail, and then expanded on it. The culture ultimately is what I look for when taking on a client, when acting as a director, and in using that case again as an example, given the CIO had an embedded culture within the entity itself, coming from a top-down approach, that's always obviously very welcome because it makes life somewhat easier to get on with governance in general, then good governance, and then applying various aspects within good governance, including the independent director coming in and possibly challenging the CIO in that case. It's not always the case. Sometimes, be it the CIO or the COO or others within the manager, whoever's making the call on the board of the manager or of the fund, might deem portfolio management, obviously, as the most important and the only important aspect. So then there's a lot of practical, ongoing discussions at a board level. But as I mentioned before, thankfully, in the last couple of years, there's been a lot of discussions, a lot of guidance notes, and now also coming from the investor perspective. So it's both a top and a bottom-up approach, whereby now people are having to listen to the boards, be it, again, the CEOs or what have you, to apply adequate good governance, and hence the challenge is somewhat less. There are areas which are easier to put in place. There are areas which are somewhat more difficult, but finding the right individuals, be it the independent person or others who sit on the board who might be less independent, as I mentioned before, is key. And also taking into account, the bigger aspects, as in what I was getting to before, is that one big aspect I see about the board, like other areas within the respective firms, is the importance of governance to be able to defend, if you wish, the rights and the requirements of the investors. And there's a lot to it in that statement, but also that holds very much true in the case of when, or hopefully mitigating, but when you do have difficulties. So if you have a strong board who even have possibly been through such difficulties before, I actually favor if somebody had a difficult situation rather than shying away with it, because they know, they can somewhat hold the hand of the board and then everybody else to see what needs to be put in place, hopefully before, if not after, some issue, be it a lockup, be it an illiquid position, be it a difficult investor, well, whatever it may be, to be able to not be too concerned and run through the process in if you wish, in an organized method. Not always easy, always very much dependent on the size of the fund, on the liquidity of the strategy. So it's not one size fits all. But I think keeping in mind when you are constituting a board that, yes, it might not be cheap to have more than 3 or more independent directors or what have you, but over time, I think these things will help to feel comfortable that you have a good composition to help in difficult times as well.
So we've touched, both Reggie and Adam, on the importance of composition, be it of boards or of committees, for the purpose of bringing different perspective and different types of challenge to situations that arise. Mike and I are accountants. We write ICAPs and do other things like that, and often we feel a little bit that we're operating in a vacuum. And Mike, maybe you can say a few words on the importance of getting that wider perspective in the ICAP process, for example.
Sure. I mean, as a Prudential practice, we do help firms with their ICAPs, with their liquidity risk management frameworks, all things that the regulator requires and ultimately are good governance to have documented. We often deal with one person at a firm, or perhaps it's just one person that does the lion's share of the work. We tend to find that the best results come when, at a very early stage, other input is gained from other areas. So risk, compliance, HR, accounts, operations, all have something to say, which factors into the initial analysis of risks and the mitigations thereof, and the overall conclusions around whether additional capital is required to mitigate those risks. And it's, whilst a majority of ICAPs go to board for sign-off, it's often too late to effectively embed the thought process into the kind of body of the document and the process itself. Ultimately, the firm is the one that knows its business, and each division knows its division and the risks that are associated to it. So they're going to have the most input into the way that affects the overall conclusions. We also see, on occasion, where the preparer of the ICAP doesn't necessarily have the appropriate voice on the board and cannot or isn't necessarily able to challenge those with sign-off to effectively input into the process. And finally, the best way, or certainly the best way to complete that process off is to effectively have senior management or those charged with the governance of the firm ratify the document and having fully understood it, but critically challenge the process that's been undergone as well. Another, just on culture, often it's seen as a regulatory requirement as opposed to good governance. I mean, it is a good governance process, and normally on kicking off an ICAP process with a client or a liquidity risk process with a client, we will have a conversation on the outset, and it's not very long before they start kind of realising the value that goes into that process and actually the fact that it could have a positive impact on their business and the way it's run in the long run.
Thanks, Mike. Scott, from an operational due diligence perspective, culture must be a very hard thing to really get your hands around and assess. How do you go about that?
We sort of thought about it before. I think I think we concluded it was very difficult to have metrics to evaluate culture, then, especially across different sort of firms and different type of investment managers. We look at it guess there is one overriding theme, and there's a sort of theme of transparency. And I think we've historically found that people who are generally better communicators, more open, more descriptive, and more detailed in the descriptions they're providing to us, we find that sort of openness is easier to work with. And we found that generally people that are more communicative and more confident generally have better control procedures and a better awareness, which is quite important for us. We found historically, and again, it's not scientific, but a couple of examples where people have been more reluctant to reveal information or more reluctant to go into detail, that in fact the control infrastructure is generally a lot weaker. And whether that's because people are fearful of how something might be evaluated or just not confident in how they've structured things. And they're hiding something, I don't know, but that's been our history. But I think we look at, I was thinking about this, and we look at effectively three things, I think. We look at a risk and compliance awareness, if you will, the ability to understand that the activities, the operational activities and oversight activities of trading, transacting, of reconciling, whatever that may be at the organization, and what sort of risk and compliance consequences or effects those might have. Secondly, we look at whether the structure enables people to challenge, or to use Reggie's word, empowers people to challenge, so whether they're appropriate structures where people can challenge things, reject things, or veto things. And thirdly, and I think the most important but also the most subjective, is whether the person who is empowered or enabled to change things, reject things, challenge things, has the character and competence to actually do it, to carry it through. And we found that very difficult to sort of opine on. But I think in terms of some of the characteristics we'd see is there, I guess, a sufficient seniority and experience of the person? Are they knowledgeable? And are they, I mean, to talk about integrity and ethics, I think that's also hard to value. But do you get the impression that that they're confident enough in their own abilities, if they don't believe a firm is operating in the right way and they're not listened to, that they would walk away and do something else because they're worried about their own reputation? And we think if you get that person, if the structure, if they have the risk and compliance awareness, if they are enabled or empowered with the structure, and they do have that sort of character, then we think we're sort of partnering with the right people who have the right culture at the organization.
Reggie, sure.
I think it's quite easy to sort of sit up here and be like, oh, yay, my firm really likes governance. I've worked for absolutely diabolical firms. And the question, I think, if I'm sitting in your seat is, okay, I'm not that firm. I'm fairly marginalized because many of us in legal and compliance are at our smaller firms. I would like to see more focus on governance. And how do I make this happen? How do I become one of these firms that cares about governance? And how can I influence my firm to be in a more comfortable position there? And I don't have all the answers for that. I have walked away from firms because I've been deeply uncomfortable. I've been in firms where it was less black and white, and you're just trying to get the right message across. I think the one thing, and I think investors are very key here, because what I have found at the more questionable firms is that they're not, for some reason, they don't really care about the regulator necessarily. That's not what's driving them. That's sort of like an afterthought at some of these firms, unfortunately. I think that's still the case, less so perhaps because we're getting more aggressive regulators, or it's sort of getting around the regulator. But I have learned that really one of the ways to get your message through is to speak the commercial aspects of it and to speak what the investors want. So if you just kind of continually drive home, this is about what our investors seek, this is how we get better investors, this is how we grow the business commercially, this is how we make money, that message seems to get through a lot more clearly. So, I think if you're looking to try to improve your governance structures, we all kind of drank the Kool-Aid generally. Like for us, we get it. Good governance makes sense. It's good business, as Mike was saying. But we sometimes work for, principals and senior people who don't drink that Kool-Aid. The Kool-Aid they drink is rimmed with gold flecks and, makes a little chinky noise when they move the cup around. And for them, my advice is speak that language, because there is a strong correlation between the quality of your investors and governance. So that's one avenue of attack, I would say.
Thanks. Just looking at the votes we've received so far and some of the questions we've raised, the most popular question we've got, we're very fortunate that we actually decided to ask that one as a polling question, so I think I'll run the polling question now, please. So the response we've got is 70% of the audience believe that more documentation is a better way of demonstrating good governance, and just under 30% believe less. Reggie, I know you've got quite a few strong views on this, and I'm sure you'd like to jump in.
Well, looking at this, I would say this is a highly FCA-regulated group, because I think there is an argument that the more SEC-sided people, the blue piece of the pie, the blueberry pie piece gets bigger. This for me is a really live issue. It's one that I'm kind of engaging with in my own mind and kind of at our firm. It's something I've actually decided that I want to take to the board of directors to get their opinion, because I've sort of taken my own stance on this and kind of formulated the governance structures at the firm accordingly. And my view is you want to have a very credible, you want to be able to go to your investors and to your regulators with as much credibility as possible. And that means really doing everything that you do with substance. And that means documenting it and being quite open kimono and being quite, comfortable. Again, this is coming from a slightly, happy world where you get a lot of senior support. However, if you go to sort of US-based compliance conferences like this, and you sort of speak to more US-based individuals, they caution documentation. There is a theory out there that the SEC will use your documentation against you. So you need to be sparing and thoughtful with your documentation. So if you're dual regulated, if you're dealing with the SEC in particular, to some degree the CFTC, and you do, for example, an annual review, and you're kind of you're doing the gap analysis and identifying where you have weaknesses. Well, the SEC will come in and say, let's see your annual review. You hand them your annual review, and that basically makes kind of the framework of their deficiency letter. So there are people who say, well, you're required to do an annual review, but you're not required to document it. So, I think, what I'm finding and what I'm grappling with now is that you have in an FCA regime, the FCA has an expectation that you are open and forthright with the regulator. And, you have kind of, you even can kind of get into Principle 11 issues if you sort of fail on that scope. The FCA really wants to see evidence that you're doing what you're saying that you're doing, evidence that you're engaged, et cetera. And that means documenting what you're doing. But there is, and I'm just putting out there is, kind of a frame of thought out there in the US world, which is, ooh, this is really dangerous. You need to be very, very careful how much you document, what you document, how you present it, et cetera. So I think, for me, you just have to decide about your business. You probably do need to talk to other people about how, you need to talk to your principals about sort of the risks of the the strategy you choose. I hate to use the word strategy because to me this is really should be quite organic and natural. To me, all of this is about building your business, and the regulators are sort of a facet of that. But you do what you do to build a good business. That often involves doing lots of gap analyses. Doing a gap analysis and collecting data can get answers you don't love. How do you record those answers? Then you promptly fix them. But for the SEC, that prompt fixing of a problem isn't always going to get you out of jail. Or jail, figuratively, not literally. Hopefully not literally. So anyway, I think this is a big question, actually, for those who are multi-jurisdictionally regulated, because the regulators are not harmonized on this point, in my view. And there is a lot of documentation sitting in your file cabinets and on your computers that can go both ways. And so you just really need to make sure that you're making both regulators happy in the best way you know how. But I think there is a challenge there. And if people have answers to that challenge, I'm all ears at lunch. So,
Scott, I'm putting aside for a moment the legal and regulatory risk associated with documentation. I'm guessing from your perspective it makes your job an awful lot easier if you see more. What are firms potentially missing out on by not documenting?
I think we also have a trading business, obviously USS, and we trade in public markets. And one of the things we've undertaken on the operations side of our business is to extensively document things. And two reasons, obviously, there's a control point. But secondly, to train new staff, and as the sort of volume of transactional activity increases, and as people sort of go from more junior roles to more senior roles, it's quite good to have, obviously, a very prescriptive detail of what needs to be done and what the objective is of what they're doing. So we have screenshots, and we sort of, as I'm sure all the operations manuals have, time for updating who's responsible for the policy, et cetera, what systems are used, how they interact, who reviews, who signs off. So we have that. I think also it gives people comfort that there's a standard that's being achieved, I think. If you think of someone from my perspective, if I have, say, 3 hours with an investment manager and maybe another hour or two to review a whole load of documentation, at the end I need to opine on whether we want to give £100 million to an investment manager. I want to be in a position where I'm comfortable with my conclusion. And obviously if it's supported by documents of process, and I have comfort those processes are followed and that they're overseen and they're performed by competent and experienced people, then it's easier for me. If I'm missing one piece of the puzzle and I have to sort of, circumnavigate or triangulate with other pieces of information, it just makes my job harder, and it gives me less confidence, I think, in the conclusion I arrive at. So I think we do put a lot of emphasis on documentation, and we think it's beneficial just from as organizations get larger and you want to have a scalable organization, that's good to have procedures that new people can follow. But to Reggie's point, we do like to see that they're actually being followed so that they're at the right level and they're of substance for people to sort of, so that they're useful and they mitigate risk.
Thank you. I wanted to finish off with a discussion around how governance in an organisation might change as the business grows. And actually we have a very popular question on just that subject. So let me phrase it that way. And the question has been phrased as, how easy is it for smaller firms to demonstrate compliance with the AIFM requirement to functionally and hierarchically separate risk management from other business risks? Adam, wry smile.
Well, I think this touches upon both questions, and I just wanted to add a bit to the previous question as well before I get into this one, if I may. And coming from a director perspective, which depends on which side you're going to be it the investment manager or the director itself, there's also how much information is too much information because you're taking on too much risk. So there's a documentation aspect, so taking the minutes or what have you, getting a pot of both back together, and then how much information should you actually request from time to time? Because if you have a list of all the trades, for example, you need to be an expert in the strategy and all. But then on the flip side, there is the requirement for documentation from showing what you've done, be it the oversight function, and getting to the next question as far as the delineation between the risk management and portfolio management. I think I just wanted to throw in one thing, in setting up boards as well, which I think is very important for me, is the company secretary, because I think that's a very important role, always taking into account the size of the fund, whether it's retail or institutional investors, the composition of the board. But the company secretary, the way I see it, at least when I act as board, besides the fact that I have an operational staff to back me up, is that person is adequately also competent to be able to take adequate minutes, depending on the degree of the minutes. I appreciate that, but also taking on action points, which are very important, because you spend 2 hours talking. Sorry, my mic's going off, but. And then you don't follow up with respect to any action points that need to be done. So I think that the COSEC comes in play to ensure there's a follow-up, there's a good composition of the board pack itself, it's adequately distributed to the board members, because you can't get it on the day of the board meeting. If there's ever going to be a scrutiny, that might be picked up, and there's no way you can read 200 pages on the same day. So there's all elements to consider, and I think somebody needs to be charged, be the COSEC or others, to be able to manage all that. And then coming back, sorry, long-winded way of coming back to the previous question, how do you capture? So I think, like everything else, there are good controls to be put in place, but it's one thing putting controls in place, there's another thing being able to show an element of documentation, to show monitoring of those controls. So one thing I favor and one thing we put in place from a Cordium perspective is obviously monitoring. So identification of whatever those risks are, so be it differentiating between portfolio management and risk management or others for that, and having an adequate ongoing monitoring, be it from the compliance individuals or others within the firm, to be able to show that there's adequate scrutiny. I think risk management was always important and embedded within the fund management industry itself. But obviously now with UCITS previously and now with AFM, it's more pronounced, and one has to ensure there's actual segregation between the two, depending on the size of the fund, because if you're less than 100 million, you can somewhat get a derogation from that segregation, but assuming it's above 100 million, then I don't think you have much option. And hence, what does that also derive? I think it's important that there's obviously the right risk officers and the right risk function and all, and similarly for portfolio management, particularly the reports up to the board. So as a board member, ensuring that you get adequate reports from the respective core areas to be able to see that they're carrying out their respective function. That's a few thoughts I have on my end.
Thanks, Adam. And Scott, as firms grow, do you look for different things in governance? Do you potentially put conditions on firms you invest with that as they grow to a certain size, certain things will happen in the governance framework?
I think the one thing we have required in the past is for additional or sort of independent directors to be appointed, sort of a condition of investment within 12 months of, say, our investment. But to get a majority independent board. I think we generally expect, and there's no hard and fast rules, we generally expect larger firms to sort of bring sort of skill sets in-house. So if they're outsourcing compliance, or outsourcing certain legal services, or outsourcing technology. Technology generally stays frequently outsourced, but we'd expect to bring some resourcing in-house and have maybe less reliance on the outside party, or there might still be a consulting relationship. And we generally expect there to be more committees. Now, I don't know if you get to a situation where you have too many committees overseeing, but we generally expect there to be more committees as trading volume increases and maybe the nature and the complexity of the instruments traded increase. But we don't have any sort of hard and fast requirements generally.
Great, thanks. We're running out of time, but there's one question I would like to put to the panel. It's a little bit left field, I think, but it could be interesting. And that question is if the FCA cannot measure culture, how can we be expected to? So any volunteers to go first?
I think from a cultural perspective, a culture, you can, as I mentioned before, you can feel it, you can see it. I don't think you can really measure it, other than seeing, as Scott mentioned earlier, what is actually structured within the entity itself. So if you do have various committees and you do have regular committees and board meetings being held, then you already know that there's an element of culture. But I think one thing is that it's not only at a board level or a CIO level. I think it's important that governance and culture itself is within the overall structure in itself. So pretty much all management needs to believe in a proper culture and a proper good governance. Otherwise, you're always going to get a lot of resistance. That's my 2 cents thoughts. I don't know if anybody else has any.
I mean, I'd agree with that. As a CCO, my kind of mantra is everyone in my firm is a compliance officer. I'm just the ultimate resource. So, no one should be sort of saying, I'm the compliance section. Everyone in our firm is. I think that's true of what you're saying about governance. However, certainly in my experience, again, kind of saying, having worked for sort of less governance-oriented firms and more governance-oriented firms, the difference I do see is in senior management. And if you want change in your firm, you have to get the buy-in of your principals. Over time, they shape the culture of the firm. They shape the values of the employees. I've watched traders come in from, shall we say, more loosely governed firms, and peer pressure gets them on the straight and narrow, and they know that there are things they probably could have done at their previous firms that they simply won't do at our firm. But you hit a tipping point. You need that tipping point because that can just as easily go the other way. So from my perspective, if you're trying to change the culture, it really means trying to work on that very senior people, because they really do influence the nature of the firm.
I really don't want to keep you from lunch, but there's another question that's just shot up the chart, and it's really quite interesting, specifically for you, Scott. So maybe we'll end with this one. And the question is, do shoddy policies tend to reflect shoddy practices?
I think, let's tie that in with the last question. I think we were talking about sort of culture and policies. One of the things we're looking at is, and as people are, to sort of think about whether we believe that this sort of business is sort of going to be a long-term going concern, a sort of a sustainable business, working with external investors. And then to answer that, we sort of talked about various elements. One of the things we also looked about is the thoroughness and detail. So we had one investment manager that didn't have a compliance manual, but told me all their compliance policies were available sort of online for people to look at. And I'm thinking, they couldn't show that to me anyway when I asked. But I'm thinking, okay, so very possibly they're in breach of some guideline somewhere in the US or in the UK. And two, there's really no thoughtfulness that A, the investor might ask for this and might want to see that, or B, how do you actually manage something where you have policies all over in different folders on your system? Should you not have, I know at USS we have one little icon that pops up when you go to your home screen. In compliance, you can search on compliance. Should you not have one manual? And then when we went and saw the investment manager in question, I thought they were fairly shoddily organized. There's still reams of paper. I asked them about cross-trading, and they produced this 200-page report where apparently they sort of thumbed through all the pages and looked for any similar names amongst their funds to see if there's any cross-trading. And I'm thinking, that it's just not well thought out, this sort of business. So how, if it's sort of shoddy in that regard, it's probably shoddy in terms of the implementation, and they're probably not attracting people who want to work in that environment. So they're not attracting quality and competent people. So I think the short answer is yes. And to be honest, I tried to think how it might be otherwise. And unless it's some oversight or blip, I think it's generally consistent with the attitude towards investor capital and running the business long term.
Seeing nods from amongst the panel, so I'm assuming no dissenting voices, or maybe everyone's just hungry by now. So thank you very much, my panel, and well, please enjoy your lunch. Thank you.